Dear students, today we are going to discuss about friction. What is this friction? Imagine you have allowed a ball to move the surface of the ground. The ball will move to a particular distance and it will be stopped ultimately. Why is that? Because there was an opposing force acting against the motion of the ball. This opposing force acting against the motion of an object is known as the frictional force. So this is always applied in between the surfaces in contact. So we learn about different types of frictional force. Here I have drawn a wooden block which is on the surface of a table, and by using a hook I have connected a Newton balance to apply a force on the wooden block. So the force applied on the Newton balance is known as X, while the opposing force acting against the motion of the wooden block is the frictional force, and it is named as F. So first I apply a little force on the Newton balance, and the wooden block will not move. If it is not moving, there is no any unbalanced force acting on the wooden block. Therefore, I can say the force applied is equal to the opposing force or the frictional force. Therefore, there is no any motion. Then I further increase the force applied. I increase X gradually. Then accordingly, the force F or the frictional force will also be increased. That means according to the force we apply, the frictional force will get adjusted. So when I further increase X, F will further be increased. And at this instance, as always, X is equal to F. The object does not move, and the frictional force acting in that instance is known as the static frictional force. In Sinhala we call this as Sthithika Gharshana Balaya. Then once I further increase X, F will also be increased, and the frictional force or F will reach the maximum value possible. In that instance, the wooden block will just start to move. So, F will reach the maximum value possible. And that maximum frictional force is known as the limiting frictional force. Seemakari Gharshana Balaya. Limiting frictional force. Then the object will just start to move. Then when I further increase the force applied, or when I further increase X, that X has exceeded the maximum F, or X has exceeded the maximum frictional force. Then as there is an unbalanced force acting on the object, it will move continuously. So when the object is moving, the frictional force applied is known as the dynamic frictional force. Gatika Gharshana Balaya. Right, these are the three instances. In the first instance, as there is no any unbalanced force, or as the external force is equal to the frictional force, the object does not move. The frictional force applied in that instance is the static frictional force. Then in the second instance, the frictional force reaches the maximum value possible, which is known as the limiting frictional force. and the object just starts to move. In the third instance, as the force applied exceeds the maximum frictional force, the object moves continuously. When an object is moving, the frictional force applied against its motion is known as the dynamic frictional force. If we draw a graph taking the external force or the force applied to x-axis and the frictional force to y-axis, in the first instance, once I increase the external force gradually, the frictional force will also be increased. Therefore, this is the static frictional force where the object does not move, and the frictional force will reach the maximum value possible. Then it is known as the limiting frictional force. And then once the force applied has exceeded the maximum frictional force, the object will move continuously. There, the frictional force applied is known as the dynamic frictional force. Dynamic frictional force. So here you can see limiting frictional force is somewhat higher than the dynamic frictional force. It is because this includes the external force which is needed to initiate the motion of the object.